Tēnā koutou katoa. In case you haven't had a chance to read the blurb, just very quickly, I'm very fortunate to be the community organiser at NZEI Aotearoa with the primary role of implementing our climate change policy. So in effect, the first paid, almost full-time organiser on climate change in the union's movement in Aotearoa. So I'm feeling very blessed and privileged to work in this space. Isn't it weird that we are having a Zoom about walking, but still very much a privilege, I think. I've started to interact at the international level with other climate activists and education unions, and it's very humbling when you get into that space because most countries are dealing with things like the sanitary effects of this ongoing pandemic and all kinds of social exclusion issues. So thank you, Linda. I'm also conscious of my own tendency to wander about, so I've just put my timer on. So just for next slide, please. Is it Andy that's driving the slides? Thank you. So just for those who may not be familiar, NZEI Aotearoa, we're the union in Aotearoa for now over 50,000 support staff, teachers, principals, and other education professionals working in the primary area and secondary schools, early childhood, special education, and school advisory services. So we have the sister union, the PPTA, in the secondary space, and the Tertiary Education Union is a sister organisation as well. And our union passed a climate change policy in September 2016, and my role is to work with members to support them to be active on climate change. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity to really get into communities through schools and early childhood centres to instil those really important values. Next slide. Thanks, Andy. So I'm not going to speak specifically to these topics. I've got some other topics, but I think broadly, and I took these points from the excellent Climate Justice Taranaki roadmap to 2030, and it's not exclusive by any means, but some of the things we urgently need to do to completely transform the way that New Zealanders get around with a much stronger focus on investing in walking, cycling and electrified public transport include these things. So promoting localised activity, promoting frequent, well-connected and free public transport, phasing out private vehicle ownership, increasing sharing, and you know this hui particularly is focusing on active modes of transport such as walking and cycling. And by the way, we should remember what happened during the pandemic and how important it was that people were able to access online communication, and for some parts of our community that wasn't so easy. Next slide, thanks, Andy. So I guess this is the main focus. I've got 4 areas that I wanted to talk to. I'm really happy to send these slides on later because all of the words are in my notes pages. But so what does transport equity look like from an educational, child rights and workers perspective? Because that's the fish pond, if you like, that we swim around as educators in the union here. And just thinking about the lockdown, what experiences can we draw on? So in the lockdown, the big one, we saw that our communities had the opportunity to reclaim our streets for exercise and recreation. People worked from home, many still do, and schools had to swing very quickly into fully online mode. And that threw up some experiences that I think can inform how we do things differently, particularly for people in low socioeconomic situations, for tamariki Māori, for disabled people, actually for elderly people and for workers. At present, many of our cities and rural areas aren't designed for safe, active transport. If more children were able to walk, cycle, bus or skate safely to school, there would be a decline in vehicles on the road. There'd be increased fitness and well-being, and children would be supported to be more healthy, active and independent. And there are countless ways to promote active transport, as you very well know. I'm not telling you anything new. I guess, the equity aspect of that is that not everyone has the time or resources to make this transition. So it's really important that schools and whānau play a role. So we were pleased to see the Climate Change Commission's report recommending a coordinated approach to decision making on transport across government and local councils. And Enviro schools, of course, play a really important role in encouraging walking to school with their campaign every March. And actually workers in their unions have a great role to play as well. So unions have traditionally focused not just on industrial issues, but on social issues too. And union members in this context, I'm talking about education union members, well, we're embedded in our local communities. We're the teachers, the teacher aides, the principals, the early childhood workers, and we can play a role in helping ensure that the transition is fair and that people understand what we're trying to deal with, both in terms of reducing emissions, connecting children to the whenua, and adapting to this big change that is now coming at us. Next slide, thanks, Andy. And I'm really conscious that this is a walking summit, so I won't dwell too long on these other areas, but they are, of course, part of the puzzle. Cheaper and free public transport is now being offered in many cities across the globe. Some countries have been doing this for several decades, and at the very least, public transport should cost less to take a whānau on the bus or train than to take a private petrol car. If cheap or free public transport needs to be phased in, it can be offered in various ways. We really support the Pōneke Collective for Public Transport Equities campaign, calling on the government to work with Greater Wellington Regional Council to run a trial of free public transport for community service card holders. You could throw gold card holders in there, couldn't you, Judith? And tertiary students in the Greater Wellington region at both on and off peak hours. So there are positive outcomes, I think, if we start looking at the changing our transport modes in terms of if we offered free public transport, the gross amount of funding normally spent on new roads could be redirected to cover the costs of the shift, as well as paying decent wages to transportation staff and providing better, improved transport routes and services and easier access for all people. Next slide, thank you. And I note that already there's a trial of free public transport being planned in Auckland. So in terms of transport equity and workers in more depth, as we pursue a just transition to a low emissions economy, it's important to take every opportunity to raise standards of employment as we lower carbon emissions. And just yesterday, I learnt that the government is reviewing its public transport operating model. So we commented through our peak body, the Council for Trade Unions, that the existing public transport operating model has not delivered good outcomes for service quality or employment standards or environmental and public health impacts. So we recommended a shift from a competitive market model to one that focuses on public value, which of course would include value for money, but also broader outcomes of good employment and low carbon emissions. I won't go on about the transition of public transport to a zero emissions electric fleet because we're here to talk about walking, but I think broadly in terms of our members who generally have to attend school, I think equity on the transport in the transport space looks like supporting them to take public transport, to ride share, to walk to work if at all possible, as well as work flexibly wherever they can. I'm really conscious that others on this panel want to say things. Oh, sorry, next slide, please, Andy, about disabled people. But I also want to say that, because it's the other part of my job is working with, as an ally with other members in the disability community who are active on education, is that when we submitted to the Climate Change Commission's draft report, we did this in consultation with the Disabled People's Assembly. Transport systems need to work for disabled people. and elderly people. And often I think those issues, the same kind of issues can come up around access. And we need to ensure urban and transport planning removes barriers for disabled communities. Disabled people are experts in their own lives, and their leadership should be supported in the response to climate change. So many of the DPA's recommendations that they put forward to the Climate Change Commission, we echoed in our own submission to the Commission as well. That's really my picture. I've dedicated myself to not going over time, and now I'm 51 seconds short of 10 minutes. I hope that kind of was a coherent delivery. Tō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.